I'm Steve Geyer, Assistant Superintendent of Instruction, and as Dr. Raley said, we have given this presentation or a similar version of it many times over the last few months. I'm going to go over a little bit of the timeline just so folks have some context for the conversation and how long we have been kicking this around, not only internally but with community feedback as well. It is being recorded, full transparency. If you have a burning question while I present, certainly jump in. I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible so that when we do archive it, hopefully it's efficient for folks and helpful. And then we're going to have plenty of opportunity at the end for questions and answers, feedback that you all want to put forward. That would be an awesome time for that. So I imagine a lot of what's on your mind will be covered during the presentation. Again, not my calendar, not Dr. Raley's calendar. It is not my responsibility to sell you on it. It is really to inform. I think it's got a lot of great potential, but we want to hear from you. We want to hear from our families, our community, and make sure that whatever recommendation Dr. Raley ultimately makes, it serves the needs of our community. So I'm going to jump in. I want to go through a little bit of kind of where we've been. The first time that we talked at all about potentially doing something different with our instructional calendar, which was March of last year, at a school board meeting and a presentation that really talked about expanding opportunities for students, and it covered a whole gamut. And one of the things that we discussed was thinking differently about the instructional calendar. So that was March of last year. That was the first mention of it. It got some legs, and we continued conversations throughout the spring. We actually had 17 community stakeholder meetings. Stakeholders included our staff, stakeholders included schools, PTA, officers. We talked with officials from youth sports in the community, YMCA, faith-based organizations in our community. We had lots and lots of conversations. So that happened throughout the spring. We provided our school board with an update in July, and essentially the feedback at that point from the board was continue to explore. So we have continued to explore through the summer and since this school year has opened with meetings just like tonight's meeting. And so the representation on the screen, the filled in circles are the meetings we've had. The open circles, we've got 2 left after tonight. We've got 1 more in-person meeting and 1 more virtual meeting next week. I think next week wraps up our 6 or 7 larger group community meetings. So we'll continue to have conversations like this, collect feedback. As Dr. Raley mentioned, we have surveys out. We had a survey out to our staff. We've heard from our staff. We have a survey out to our families that's open until October 29th. Part of the motivation to get this video posted is to make sure that folks that haven't been able to attend can hear the presentation and make an informed response in their survey. And then ultimately, Dr. Raley will make a recommendation to the school board November-December timeframe. The recommendation could be calendar just like we're accustomed to, could be a different instructional calendar for next year. As Dr. Raley mentioned, it could be a different instructional calendar 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So all options are on the table, and the feedback that we get is critically important to making a recommendation to the school board for consideration, again, November-December. Quick tie-in, because this is important. We're going to talk about why are we even considering a different instructional calendar. We'll get into that in a minute. And a big part of that is really driven by the school division's mission, which is to maximize the potential of every learner. And that drives the work that we do all day, every day, the decisions that we make, and the notion of thinking differently about the instructional calendar, we believe has potential to expand opportunities for students, thereby maximizing the potential of all of our learners. So there really is that direct connection. Again, that is the school division's mission statement, and it definitely relates directly to this conversation. So anytime you think about any kind of a change, the natural question is why? Why aren't we just assuming that we're going to move forward with the instructional calendar we're accustomed to? And there are several reasons, and really I tried to summarize kind of the 4 major reasons behind the conversation over the last few months. Some of them are grounded in the data that we see, and I'm going to talk about one of those in particular in a little bit more depth. I am happy if you're interested in really getting into the weeds and talking about the data. I'm happy to do that with anybody who expresses an interest. Just give me a call, shoot me an email. Happy to sit down and talk with you further. I will go into a little bit more depth with that first bullet in just a minute, which is the growth data related to math and reading and how that relates to what's often referred to as the summer slide. The summer slide is real, and we've got data locally that supports that, data nationally that supports that as well, and we'll talk about what that means. But essentially, it's quantifying the amount of progress our students make during the academic year and how that flattens out and in some cases declines over the summer. They come back to school, pick right back up, and off we go again. And so one of the potential benefits of a balanced calendar is to bring the end of the school year and the beginning of the next school year a little bit closer together to reduce some of that summer slide. So that has nothing to do with the pandemic, that first bullet. That is data that's been around for decades. The next two bullets absolutely have been impacted by the disruption of the last 18 months, and we have seen in our data locally what reflects national data, which is that individual student growth data related to reading and math, traditional achievement data related to reading and math have both been impacted by the disruption of the pandemic. And so again, potentially thinking differently about our instructional calendar could give us some opportunities to make up some of that ground that was impacted by the last 18 months. And the last bullet we really haven't talked a ton about, but I think it's worth mentioning that there is some school of thought out there that's just, hey, just because you've always done it one way doesn't necessarily make that the best way to approach teaching and learning. And so the reality is the typical school calendar was built on an agrarian model that was really appropriate at the time and maybe less appropriate today. So there is some reason to at least discuss the notion of thinking differently simply because the way we've always done it may not be the best way to do it. So those are kind of the four headlines in terms of why. I told you I was going to dig in a little bit on that first bullet, which is the growth data, student growth data related to the notion of the summer slide. And so what I've got here are our student growth results in MAP. This is grades 2 through 8. Our data is reflective of national data. I will say our percentile, when you look from left to right, is higher than national data. You would expect it to be hovering around 50. So when I say it's similar in the peaks and valleys. We've got a lot to be proud of in terms of the work happening in our classrooms and the support of our families, that our data is really, really strong. However, when you look at the increases and decreases, if you look at the bottom of the graph, you'll see that the way this is set up is it goes from fall to spring, from spring to fall, from fall to spring, and so on. And what you notice is every time there's a decline, that correlates with summer. Shouldn't be a shock at all. I've got children of my own. I know they work really hard during the school year. I know they don't work quite as hard in the summer, and that's okay. But the reality is there's a case to be made that the length of the summer impacts the pitch of that line. And so we see great student progress, the blue portion of the line from fall to spring, and then we see it dip over the summer. Again, the pitch may change a little bit, but it's always up during the academic year. It's always down during the summer. And so that is the summer slide. And that's our math data related to student growth. The next slide is the same data except for reading. And what you see is essentially the same thing, right? An increase during the academic year and a decrease during the summer. So I did want to present that because I want to make sure that the conversation is grounded not just in the disruption of the last 18 months. While the pandemic has had an impact, the reality is this conversation is worth having outside of the impact of the last 18 months because of this up and down of student progress during the academic year versus during the summer. Again, happy to dig in on more data if you're interested, but I did want to just provide a little bit of context for kind of what's driving the conversation over the last 8 months. It's important if we're going to consider this concept that we kind of have a working definition within our community, and that's been part of our conversations over the last several months. I'll go ahead and read it. A balanced calendar maintains the core 180-day instructional program, but it distributes those days differently. And you may or may not know, our current calendar has 180 instructional days. That is a requirement. The balanced calendar is built on that same 180 days. It's just distributing those days differently. We'll get into those details in just a minute. It reduces the typical summer vacation, essentially from about 10.5 weeks to more like 7 weeks, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But provides a 2-week break between each of the 4 quarters of the academic year, which may include intersessions for students and families. So that's the definition that we've been discussing over the last several months. The natural next question is, so what's an intersession? So we use the term intersession in the definition. So what is an intersession? An intersession is additional time built into the academic year when all students may participate in enrichment mini-courses, corrective instruction, academic support, acceleration, or work-based learning experiences. And that's just some of what could happen during an intersession. We'll talk about that in more depth here in just a minute. These periods of time are breaks during the academic year for students and staff who do not participate in intersessions. So the way we're discussing the intersessions during the balanced calendar is that they would be optional. Where students may take advantage of those opportunities, they may say, I need a break, and they might take a break during those intersessions. And again, I'll make it more clear in a minute what that calendar could ultimately look like. But there's the working definition for balanced calendar, working definition for intersessions, and really to kind of bring the intersessions to life a little bit. What could we do during that time? And we have talked about all kinds of great ideas. And this would be, again, available from kindergarten to preschool to 12th grade. And so obviously the opportunities would vary. And some of what we talked about for high school students, visits to college campuses, SAT prep classes, we've talked about things that often students are trying to find a way to squeeze into their lives anyways. We might be able to make those happen during intersessions, which could relieve some stress for students at the high school level for some of those activities that they're interested in anyways. Outdoor experiential learning, expansion of the arts. We talked about remediation opportunities for students who need them. So sky's the limit. And the focus of these intersessions is really going to be, what are the things we know are great for kids that we have a difficult time squeezing into the constraints of a typical school year and typical school day? And so the idea is to really make these intersessions come to life so that students want to be a part of them. And again, the discussion right now is that the intersessions would be optional. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Some more information related to intersessions, and some of this is based on conversations like this, that we know these topics are on folks' minds. The intersessions are being discussed as full instructional days that would mirror the typical school day. One intersession choice, and I'll show this in a minute, would equal 1 week. So you'll see in a second where an intersession could be 2 weeks in total, broken up into 2 separate opportunities for students. So students could opt into week 1 and take a break for week 2 or vice versa. So we'll look at that in just a minute. There would be regular meal service available to students. We would provide transportation, and there would be no charge to families. So those are all questions that have come up related to intersessions, and hopefully that provides some clarification. I'm going to illustrate the intersessions from a student perspective, and I'm going to do a quick example for a high school student as well as an elementary student that I think probably puts some more context to this. But you'll see in a minute, we've got 3 intersession opportunities in the calendar. So intersession number 1 is in October. It's 2 weeks. So that represents 2 weeks. Each one of those is 1 week. And this 11th grade student, for this example, has chosen to participate in college campus visits for week 1 of intersession number 1, and they've opted to take the 2nd week off. Okay, so that's what it would look like from a student standpoint. The other intersessions, and again, I'll show you the whole calendar in just a minute. Intersession 2 is in March. Hypothetically, the student says, I want to participate in an SAT prep class in March. And then the final intersession is at the end of the school year in June. And this 11th grader decided they wanted to opt into a job shadowing experience week 1 and to start their summer early week 2 and take the 2nd week off. So that is what it could look like from a high school junior's perspective. Here's what it could look like from a fourth grade student's perspective. Maybe that October intersession, again, they want to split their time. They know they want to take a week off and have some downtime. So they choose that for week number 2 of that first intersession. And the first week, they opt into a mini course built around science and exploring the outdoors. So that could be an example of what that October intersession could look like for a fourth grade student. March intersession, hands-on fun with cooking and math. That's their choice in March. And then in June, they choose a fine arts camp for week number 1, and they choose to take the second week off. So again, those can be moved around, but that gives you some idea from a student standpoint how these intersessions would work. So what doesn't it mean? As important as it is to put a definition to the balanced calendar, it's also important to dispel some myths. And so in all of our discussions over the last several months, we've been really clear that a balanced calendar, as we've been discussing it, is not year-round school. And you'll see in just a minute, there is a summer. Again, it's more like 7 weeks instead of 10 weeks, whereas year-round school essentially eliminates summer and distributes all of that summer break in various ways throughout the 12 months. This is not a year-round approach, and I'll show that in just a second. It doesn't mean the end of summer vacation, doesn't mean the end of winter break, doesn't mean the end of spring break. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other important piece is divisions that are operating on a year-round calendar often have some schools operating on a year-round schedule and some on a more traditional schedule. And what we have said throughout our discussions, regardless of which direction we go, our 5 schools will continue to operate on the same instructional calendar. We will not have some schools operating on one calendar and other schools operating on another. So, what could it look like? And I'll come back to these slides for discussion because I know this is what people really want to wrap their heads around. This is my best effort to put all 12 months on one slide. I recognize that they're just icons. They do not include all 30, 31 days in each month, etc. But it gives you an idea. And when I put up the blue shaded area, this is our typical instructional calendar that we're accustomed to. This is what this year looks like. It's what the last several years look like in terms of start, end of the school year. You see us starting that last week in August, school year wrapping up first week in June. That's pretty typical. 2 weeks at Christmas, time at Thanksgiving, a week off for spring break. There's some other days sprinkled in there, but that's essentially our instructional calendar that exists today. I'm going to advance the slide. You're going to see the blue shaded areas move a touch. You'll see more than anything, it's not a complete overhaul by any means, and I don't expect you to follow where everything goes. We'll discuss it in a minute, but I'm going to advance the slide and you're going to see what this would look like for a potential balanced calendar. Okay, so the major change is starting the school year earlier than we're accustomed to. And that frees up some other time during the year, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail here, for those intersessions that we talked about. And again, this is one potential structure for the balanced calendar design that we've been discussing. And so you'll see it starts students back to school the second week in August. And what you'll notice is after each of the 4 quarters of the school year, there's a break. It might be a break in the form of an intersession. It might be a break in the form of a break. And so if you'll kind of follow along with me, you'll see August and September essentially are quarter number 1, and that first break comes at the beginning of October in the form of that intersession. So that would be a 2-week intersession, the beginning of October, and that ends the first marking period. Second marking period is the second half of October, all of November, all of December, and there's another break at the end of that second marking period, and that's winter break. That isn't an intersession, it's a 2-week break for everybody like we're accustomed to. Marking period 3 starts in January, and then by the time you get to the end of March, there's the break at the end of the third marking period, and that's a combination of 1 week of intersession and 1 week of spring break. And the idea there, this adjustment has been made over the last couple months in the design of a potential balanced calendar to really ensure that our spring break continues to align with the regional spring break. And so we are doing our best to make sure that if we move forward with something like this, that it does align with the regional spring break. And so this shows that, again, the last week in March would be an intersession week. First week in April would be spring break. And then the fourth marking period begins, and you see intersession number 3 really to kind of kick off summer. And so this is what a balanced calendar could look like. You'll see that we still have 2 weeks at Christmas, we still have Thanksgiving break, we still have spring break, we still have the other days that are illustrated here in more detail, like Labor Day, President's Day, Martin Luther King Day. Those days are all still here. So I'll come back to this when we wrap up for feedback and for questions and answers, because I know this is what folks really want to kind of wrap their heads around, is what would it look like. Potential benefits, the big ones really are, there are 2 huge benefits, potential benefits. One is bringing the end of one academic year and the beginning of the next year closer together, and squeezing that summer a little bit so that there's less downtime for students. So that's one. Has the potential to reduce the summer slide. And then by way of those intersessions, we build in the potential for 25 to 30 additional learning opportunities, days of instruction for students that opt into those intersessions. So those are the 2 major potential academic benefits. And then depending on your point of view, and we've gotten some of this feedback in these conversations, what are the other benefits? Some folks have talked about it doesn't eliminate summer. Yes, it shortens summer, but we still have a summer. We've gotten a lot of feedback that some folks really like the idea of introducing a fall break, and that would be in October during that intersession period, potentially, depending on choices that students and families make. It would provide families with additional opportunities for student learning, provide our staff members with additional opportunities for compensation, and then a big part of the discussion is setting up a cadence during the year that really has more of an eye on reducing fatigue and focusing on student and staff well-being. And I think it has the potential to do that. And so that's another discussion point, is does it provide a little bit more regularity around opportunities to really exhale and catch your breath before you jump into the next quarter. So those are some of the benefits. People have been interested in what evidence is out there. There is some. There's not a ton of evidence, but there is some. And the biggest resource really in Virginia right now is a report put out by what's called JLARC. That's one of the hundreds of acronyms that we have in education in Virginia. Stands for the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. And they put out a report on non-traditional calendars back in 2012. And this comes directly from the report. And I'll read this. The research suggests that some student subgroups may experience statistically significant academic gains from non-traditional instructional calendars. Specifically, students classified as economically disadvantaged, Black, Hispanic, limited English proficient students, and those in single-parent households. That's from the research from JLARC. Also suggests that intersession instruction and shorter summer breaks may be the primary reasons for improvements in academic achievement. I'm guessing they didn't need to devote a whole lot of research and reporting to identify those as the reasons why there were benefits. Again, I think it's pretty obvious that the potential benefits lie in shortening that summer and introducing those additional instructional opportunities for students. We have been connecting with partners in Hopewell. This is year 1 for them, implementing a balanced calendar. We went and visited. We had a team that went and visited Hopewell 2 weeks ago to see their intersessions in action. So that has been helpful. Again, it's year 1 for them. And then we have talked to school officials in Wake County, North Carolina. They are operating on more of a traditional year-round calendar, but some lessons learned and some opportunities to collaborate with school divisions that have been at this a whole lot longer than Hopewell has. So our connections with those 2 school divisions have been helpful. One of the other things that's come up, and I want to focus on, we're going to use the fall season just as an example. There's been some discussion around what does this mean for athletics? What does it mean for extracurricular activities like marching band? And so I'm going to focus on these first 4 months that are really the fall season. And so this is, again, our traditional instructional calendar. So this is what our school year looks like this year. Again, the blue shaded areas being the instructional time for students. And if you are involved or have a child or grandchild involved in a fall season, you know that their summer pretty much ends the first week in August. They're back at marching band camp, they're back at football practice, they're back at cross-country practice, volleyball practice, first week in August. And so that's really what their summer looks like in the beginning of their school year. While the instruction doesn't start until the end of August, their summer really wraps up at the end of July, and they're into school obligations with extracurricular activities the first week in August. So how would that look in a balanced calendar? So what we have at the bottom is what a potential balanced calendar structure could look like. Athletics and extracurricular activities would start at the same time. There has been some discussion about how that would impact marching band because they use the first 2 weeks. My understanding is they're full days. And so we would have to work with Mr. Gibbons at the high school if we were to move in this direction and come up with a way to make sure that those students had those same opportunities before the instructional day started, or instructional school year started that second week in August. Athletics, there really wouldn't be an impact. Those students are engaged in their athletic obligations that first week in August, and it just means that their school year would start week 2 of their athletic practices instead of further into August. There wouldn't be any changes with competitions. That's all sanctioned by VHSL. So regardless of any adjustments we made to our calendar, practices would continue, competitions would be played. Yes, competitions would continue to be played during those 2 weeks in October during intersessions, just like they are currently. And if you're a high school athlete or a marching band participant, you'd have a choice to make as to whether or not you're going to go out of town for a week and miss whatever competition that would be, because competitions would continue. So there would be no disruption to athletic competitions and the like. So that question has come up, wanted to provide a little bit more clarity to that. And then the last slide is really just to represent a lot of feedback that has come from conversations like this evening. And we've taken notes. We continue to get back to questions that have come up that we don't have answers to yet. And I just want to demonstrate to the audience that we are continuing to hear you, and this list will continue to grow. So as you have feedback tonight, you can expect this list will continue to be expanded. But this is some of the feedback we've gotten from participants, discussions that continue to get consideration as we continue the discussion. So it's not exhaustive, but did want to provide that context. And just a reminder to everybody, that's where we are right now. Okay, so the conversation's been going on for months. As Dr. Raley said, he is interested in all of the feedback and all of the data that we will have through our surveys, conversations like this, because ultimately he will make a recommendation to the school board for their consideration. So I hope tonight's been helpful, the information that I just presented, and I'm going to jump back to that slide that's got all 12 months on the same slide with what a balanced calendar could look like, and open it up for questions. Dr. Raley and I, other team members that are here, I'm happy to answer questions that you have and certainly want your feedback. And I appreciate your attendance tonight and look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to open up the floor. I'll jump back to that slide. I'd love to hear feedback.